On a quiet night at a tropical resort, a gang of kidnappers spotted a wealthy black couple and assumed they had an easy target. They saw the designer bracelet, the carefree smiles, the relaxed confidence of people who seemed untouchable. They waited for the right moment and abducted the wife, convinced the husband would pay without question. What they did not know was that he was a Navy SEAL, relentless, unforgiving, and trained to hunt those who threaten what he loves. He would not bargain, he would not plead. He would find them, dismantle their operation, and bring her home himself. And by the time he was done, their gang would be destroyed, their empire shattered, and their leader behind bars. The sun dipped low over the endless stretch of turquoise water, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The gentle lull of the waves kissed the shore, a rhythmic whisper against the pristine white sand. Ale King leaned back in his lounge chair, his muscled frame relaxed but never fully at ease, even here. A cool breeze rustled through the towering palm trees, carrying the scent of salt and something sweeter, the faint trace of Alicia's coconut-scented sunscreen. She sat beside him, her dark curls catching the last golden rays of the setting sun, a vision of effortless grace. A cocktail glass, the rim dusted with sugar, dangled loosely from her fingertips as she traced lazy patterns into the sand with her free hand. Her skin, kissed by the sun, glowed against the white linen cover-up draped over her swimsuit. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet street, and together they stood in the warmth of a future no longer haunted by the past. The battle was over, the nightmare was gone, and peace at last had come home. Love and vengeance, a tale of redemption. On a quiet night at a tropical resort, a gang of kidnappers spotted a wealthy black couple and assumed they had an easy target. They saw the designer bracelet, the carefree smiles, the relaxed confidence of people who seemed untouchable. They waited for the right moment and abducted the wife, convinced the husband would pay without question. What they did not know was that he was a Navy SEAL, relentless, unforgiving, and trained to hunt those who threaten what he loves. He would not bargain, he would not plead, he would find them, dismantle their operation, and bring her home himself. And by the time he was done, their gang would be destroyed, their empire shattered, and their leader behind bars. The sun dipped low over the endless stretch of turquoise water, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The gentle lull of the waves kissed the shore, a rhythmic whisper against the pristine white sand. Ale King leaned back in his lounge chair, his muscled frame relaxed but never fully at ease, her dark curls catching the last golden rays of the setting sun, a vision of effortless grace. A cocktail glass, the rim dusted with sugar, dangled loosely from her fingertips as she traced lazy patterns into the sand with her free hand. Her skin, kissed by the sun, glowed against the white linen cover-up draped over her swimsuit. "You're thinking too much," she murmured, not bothering to look at him. Azel smirked, shifting his gaze from the horizon to his wife. "I don't think that's possible." Alicia finally turned her head, her dark eyes sparkling with amusement. "Yes, it is. You're sitting in literal paradise, but I can already see your brain running tactical assessments. You've probably memorized every exit off this beach, haven't you?" Ale exhaled a soft laugh, his head tilting back slightly. "Maybe." She sipped her drink, the condensation from the glass cooling her fingertips. "Just once I'd love to see you turn it off." Azel studied her for a long moment, the love he had for her set deep in his chest. She had always been the one to remind him that life wasn't just about survival, it was about living. Even after all these years, she still looked at him the way she always had, with knowing patience and a quiet challenge. "For you," he said, voice low and smooth, "I'll try." Alicia gave him a satisfied smile before setting her drink aside and standing up. She stretched, her body silhouetted against the soft pink glow of the sky. "Good, because I booked us a couple's massage in 20 minutes, and after that—" She leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a playful whisper. "We're going dancing." Azel raised a brow. "Dancing?" she grinned. "A nightclub, live DJ, beautiful people, that thing normal married couples do on vacation." Azel gave her an amused look, but he didn't argue. He could deny her nothing, not when she looked at him like that. For now, they were just husband and wife, black, beautiful, and basking in a moment of peace. They had no idea it would be the last one. The story continues with all the rich detail and drama, describing their night at the club, the kidnapping, the pursuit, and their ultimate triumph, but without any timestamp markers. It maintains the same powerful narrative through to its conclusion. As the sedan disappeared around the corner, Alesia stepped closer and laced her fingers with ales. The breeze carried the scent of salt and the promise of a peaceful night. They stood in silence, watching the glow of the setting sun. The weight they'd carried for weeks finally lifted. The gang was gone, the fight was over, and life once again was theirs. Alesia squeezed his hand gently and gave her a faint smile. Now we live. Her smile matched his, soft and genuine. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet street, and together they stood in the warmth of a future no longer haunted by the past. The battle was over, the nightmare was gone, and peace at last had come home. Love and Vengeance, A Tale of Redemption. Previous sections remain the same, leading up to the nightclub scene. The music thumped through the club, a heavy bass that rattled the floors and pulsed through the bodies packed into the dance floor. The scent of sweat, alcohol, and expensive perfume mixed into the air, creating an intoxicating atmosphere where people lost themselves in the rhythm, the flashing lights, and the luxury of the night. Ale and Alesia King moved through it all like they belonged there, because they did. They had chosen this club for a reason. Exclusive but not pretentious, upscale but not dull. It was the kind of place where the wealthy played, a world where a black couple could sip their drinks without sidelong glances, without hushed whispers assuming they were out of place. Ale was always aware, though. Years of military training, of reading people, sensing shifts in energy never truly left him. But tonight, he let himself breathe, let himself just be a man with his wife celebrating life. Alesia, as always, moved with effortless confidence, her deep brown skin glowing under the club's ambient light, her fitted dress hugging her curves with an elegance that made heads turn. She didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't care. She only had eyes for him. "You see, this isn't so bad," she murmured into his ear, her voice smooth, teasing. Hazel smirked. "I never said it was bad. You fought me on this. I'm still deciding if you were right." Alesia rolled her eyes but smiled, pulling him closer as the music shifted to a sultry, hypnotic rhythm. "Well then, I better make sure you remember this night." Ail didn't dance often, but for her he did, hands firm at her waist, guiding her as she pressed against him, moving in perfect sync. The world blurred, the music became distant, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about strategy or escape routes. He was just there with her. But across the room, they were being watched. 3 men sat near the VIP section, drinks in hand, talking quietly while their eyes never left Ale and Alesia. Jason Grim Toller, the leader, leaned back in his seat, cool and calculating. Ray Red Calloway, his enforcer, had a twisted smirk on his scarred face as he muttered something to the third man, Duke, who gave a low chuckle in response. "They don't belong here," Duke muttered, swirling his drink, his lip curled in something between amusement and contempt. "Some rich guy throwing money around like he owns the place," Red sneered. "Flashy, arrogant. Look at his wife, dressed like royalty. Easy pickings." His tone carried resentment, the kind that came from men who refused to believe that black wealth could come from hard work, intelligence, and success. Grim didn't respond right away. He was still watching, still assessing. He didn't care about the color of their skin. He cared about what was in their bank account. And just from the way Alesia's dress hugged her figure, from the shimmer of gold at her wrist, the diamond at her throat, he knew one thing. They were worth a fortune. Red leaned forward. "We follow him out, grab the woman. He'll pay." Grim nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Not yet. Let's see if she strays first." And as if the night had conspired to make their job easier, Alesia leaned into Ale's ear, her lips brushing against his skin. "I'll be right back," she murmured, her fingers lingering on his shoulder before she turned and disappeared toward the restroom. Ale let her go without a second thought, but the moment the bathroom door swung shut behind her, Red pushed back his chair and stood. Showtime. The story continues, describing the kidnapping, Ale's pursuit, the battles, and their ultimate triumph, leading to the same powerful ending. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet street, and together they stood in the warmth of a future no longer haunted by the past. The battle was over, the nightmare was gone, and peace at last had come home. The music from the nightclub pulsed through the walls, muffled but steady, a rhythmic beat that vibrated through the floor. The scent of citrus soap and perfume lingered in the air as Elysia stood at the sink, reapplying her lipstick. Her reflection in the mirror captured the relaxed glow on her face, a woman enjoying her evening, savoring the kind of moment she and Azel had not had in a long time. She barely registered the restroom door opening behind her at first, the sound subtle, unremarkable. But something about the way it stopped partway open made her pause. The atmosphere in the room shifted slightly, an unspoken disturbance in the air. Her eyes flicked up to the mirror, and that was when she saw it. A man stood near the entrance, unmoving, his posture rigid, his gaze set on her. He was not walking toward the stalls, nor did he seem to be waiting for anyone. He was simply there, watching. Elysia turned slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the sink, her heartbeat picking up in her chest. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark jeans and a button-up rolled at the sleeves. At a glance, he could have been mistaken for another club patron, someone who belonged here, but there was something unsettling in the way his eyes moved, scanning her as if he were making calculations in his mind. The door swung open again, and a second man stepped inside. He was stockier, with a scar running from his eyebrow down to his cheekbone. His presence erased any doubt about what this was. Elysia felt her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had always been able to read a situation, and this one told her exactly what was happening. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral. If she reacted too soon, if she showed them that she knew, it would only give them an advantage. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady, controlled. She reached for her clutch, slipping her fingers inside. "I was just leaving." The man with the scar smirked and stepped forward, casually blocking her way. "Not yet," he said. Her grip on the clutch tightened. There was only one way out of this room, and they were standing in it. If she screamed, the music outside was too loud for anyone to hear, but she knew one thing for certain. Ale would come looking for her soon. She just needed to buy herself time. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, keeping her voice cold, irritated rather than fearful, "but if you don't move." The taller man reached for her wrist. The moment his fingers touched her skin, she reacted. Elysia twisted sharply, her free hand moving fast as she snatched the small metal hairpin from her clutch and drove it toward his arm. He jerked back just in time, but she did not stop there. She kicked out, her heel slamming into his shin with enough force to make him stumble. The man grunted, but before she could pull away, the one with the scar grabbed her other wrist and yanked her forward. Elysia struggled, twisting, pulling against his grip. She was not going to make this easy for them. The taller man recovered quickly, grabbing her other arm to keep her from moving. The sudden force of both men dragging her forward made her bracelet snap off, the gold piece slipping from her wrist and falling onto the tiled floor. Neither of them noticed, but she did. Her heart pounded as she was pulled toward the door, her mind racing. The bracelet was unique, a gift from Ale, something he would recognize in an instant. If he found it, he would know something was wrong. She dug her nails into the man's wrist, making him hiss in irritation, but his grip only tightened. "Feisty one," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. He pressed his hand against her mouth, his palm rough against her skin. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." She thrashed harder, twisting, kicking, doing everything she could to slow them down. The restroom door swung open, the sound of the club pouring in, the music, the laughter, the voices of people who had no idea what was happening just feet away. Ail was somewhere out there, but he did not see her. A wave of helplessness crashed over her as they dragged her through the side exit. Inside the nightclub, the moment remained as intense as ever, the rhythm of the music vibrating through the floors, the pulse of neon lights flashing across the space in hypnotic waves. Ail stood near the edge of the dance floor, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, his fingers absent-mindedly rolling his glass between them as he waited. Elysia had stepped away some time ago, her absence initially unremarkable, a brief interlude in their evening, nothing more than the natural flow of a night out. He had let her go without hesitation, trusting she would return, knowing that she could handle herself. But now, as the minutes stretched longer than they should have, the ease he had felt just moments before began to shift, that familiar tightening in his gut stirring in the place where instinct overruled logic. His watch confirmed what he already suspected. Too much time had passed. He set his drink down, his expression remaining composed, as he began moving through the crowd with deliberate intent, scanning every face, every corner, his mind calculating possibilities as he made his way toward the hallway leading to the restroom. There was no immediate sense of panic, no wild assumptions clouding his judgment, only the creeping sensation that something was off. His instincts, owned by years of training in combat, were rarely wrong. As he stepped into the dimly lit corridor, the pounding bass softened slightly, the barrier of thick walls muting the chaos of the club behind him. A few women passed by, laughing in hushed tones, their conversations casual and unhurried, their presence normal in every way. But it was not normal that Elysia had not returned. His eyes swept the floor out of habit, catching on something near the entrance of the women's restroom. A small glint of gold flickered under the low lighting. His steps slowed, and without hesitation, he crouched, reaching down and closing his fingers around the object. The weight of it was familiar, and in an instant, his pulse quickened with a force that was invisible to the world, but undeniable within him. It was Elysia's bracelet, the one she never removed, the one that had rested against her wrist just moments before when she had danced with him, her laughter warm against his skin. There was no reason it should be here, discarded like an afterthought, unless something had gone very wrong. Straightening, he slid the bracelet into his pocket, his expression unreadable, his movements unhurried but precise as he pushed open the door to the women's restroom. The few women inside paused at his presence, their confusion evident, but he ignored them, his gaze sweeping across the space in a calculated scan. The room was empty aside from them. No immediate sign of distress, no overturned objects, nothing obvious. The absence of evidence did nothing to ease the weight pressing down in his chest. Turning back toward the hallway, he stepped through the doorway and continued moving, his strides purposeful as his mind began piecing the situation together, the facts and possibilities merging into something cold and undeniable. There were no signs of her inside the club, no messages from her phone, and now the only tangible piece of her was a bracelet left behind in a place it should never have been. That meant one thing: she had been taken. His pace quickened as he moved through the club, though outwardly his expression remained calm, controlled, composed. But beneath that exterior, something far more dangerous had settled into place, something that had not stirred in a long time. He passed the booths, the bar, the VIP sections, weaving through the crowd without hesitation, making his way toward the nearest exit, the one that provided the quickest route to the outside. As he approached the side entrance, a bouncer stood near the door, engaged in idle conversation with another staff member, both oblivious to the weight pressing down on Aile's chest. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his presence demanding immediate attention as he fixed his gaze on the man standing in front of him. "Did you see a black woman leave through here?" His voice was steady, even, but there was a sharpness beneath it that made the bouncer straighten slightly. The man glanced toward the exit before looking back at Aile, his brows furrowing as if searching his memory. "Man, a lot of people come and go. Hard to say." Aile did not break eye contact, his patience razor thin, his tone even sharper as he stepped closer, making the space between them feel significantly smaller. "Think harder." The bouncer hesitated, his expression shifting from indifference to something more cautious, sensing the weight behind the question. He glanced toward his coworker before exhaling, rubbing the back of his neck. "Now that you mention it." His voice trailed off for a moment before he nodded toward the door. "A couple of guys came through here a little while ago. They had a woman with them. She looked kind of out of it, like she was sick or something. I figured they were helping her." Aile's stomach coiled into a tight knot, though outwardly he remained unreadable. "What did they look like?" The bouncer frowned slightly, as if trying to recall the details. "Big guys. One had a scar across his face. The other was taller, blonde. They left out back." Aile turned without hesitation, pushing open the heavy metal door, stepping into the cool night air. The alley stretched into darkness, the hum of distant traffic filling the silence. His gaze swept over the pavement, moving quickly over the damp concrete until he saw it.
Did not break
Tire
eye
marks,
contact.
fresh ones. His patience razor thin, his tone even sharper as he stepped closer, making the space between them feel significantly smaller. Think harder. The bouncer hesitated, his expression shifting from indifference to something more cautious, sensing the weight behind the question. He glanced toward his coworker before exhaling, rubbing the back of his neck. Now that you mention it, his voice trailed off for a moment before he nodded toward the door. A couple of guys came through here a little while ago. They had a woman with them. She looked kind of out of it, like she was sick or something. I figured they were helping her. Ailes' stomach coiled into a tight knot, though outwardly he remained unreadable. What did they look like? The bouncer frowned slightly, as if trying to recall the details. Big guys. One had a scar across his face, the other was taller, blonde. They left out back. Ale turned without hesitation, pushing open the heavy metal door, stepping into the cool night air. The alley stretched into darkness, the hum of distant traffic filling the silence. His gaze swept over the pavement, moving quickly over the damp concrete until he saw it. Tire marks, fresh ones. A van. His pulse remained steady, his breathing slow, but inside the storm continued to rise. They had taken her. He knew it with certainty, knew that every second that passed was another second she was getting further away, knew that the men responsible had no idea what they had just started. Stepping back into the club, he pulled his phone from his pocket, pressing a number that connected after a single ring. The voice on the other end was alert, sharp, understanding more from the silence than from anything he had yet to say. Ale. His voice did not waver, did not rise, did not betray the fury beginning to coil beneath his skin. It remained controlled, composed, cold in its certainty. They took Elysia. A pause settled over the line, a silence heavy with unspoken understanding. When the response came, it was quiet, steady, carrying with it the weight of an inevitable war. Where do we start? Ailes' answer was immediate. Security feed, side entrance, 15 minutes back. The call ended as he moved swiftly, his path cutting through the club without pause. The pulsing music, the flashing lights, the press of bodies all became irrelevant, distant noise in a world that had narrowed to a single objective. His steps brought him to a worn metal door marked Employees Only, and he pushed through without hesitation. The security room was small and cramped, illuminated by the cold glow of monitors displaying every angle of the club. Behind the desk, a heavy-set man with a patchy beard and a uniform stretched tight across his stomach barely looked up from his phone. His eyes flicked upward, and the moment he registered Ale, his lip curled with the lazy smirk of a man who felt comfortable hiding behind his position. He snorted. "Security's out front." The guard muttered, his tone dry and edged with faint amusement. His gaze lingered a fraction too long, and the condescension in his voice wasn't subtle. "Didn't think this was your kind of spot." Ailes' voice cut through the room, cold and unyielding. "My wife was taken. Show me the footage. Side entrance. 15 minutes back." The guard leaned back in his chair, the smirk deepening as he folded his arms. "And you think you can just come back here and bark orders? People like you always think waving some money gets you whatever you want." Ailes' eyes locked on the man, and his voice, low and edged with ice, carried the promise of something far more dangerous than threats. "Pull the footage now." The guard's arrogance faltered. He sat up, his bravado cracking under the weight of something he couldn't place but instinctively feared. "Fine, man, relax," he muttered, turning to the console with a sour grumble. His fingers tapped the keys slowly, almost deliberately dragging his heels. Ailes stepped forward, his patience thinning to a razor's edge. Without a word, his hands brushed past the guards on the keyboard, and with quick, practiced movements he adjusted the interface. The guard stiffened. "Hey, what are you?" "You're too slow," Ailes said flatly, his eyes never leaving the screen. His fingers moved with mechanical precision, scrolling through timestamps, isolating angles. The feed rewound, the seconds ticking back until the alley behind the club flickered into view. "There," he said, his voice sharp. The footage showed two men, their movements rough and hurried, dragging Elysia toward a van. She fought them, her defiance clear even in the grainy black and white footage. but they overpowered her, shoving her forward. Ailes' jaw tightened, but his focus remained unshaken. He keyed in a command. Zoom. The guard hesitated before tapping the control, the image pulling tighter on the scene. The taller man, bald with a broad, brutish build, yanked Elysia's arm as he turned. The camera caught it, his hand wrapped around her wrist and the mark that branded his skin. Ailes' eyes sharpened, closer on his hand. The frame zoomed again, the distortion rough but not enough to hide what Ailes saw. A tattoo, black ink bold and jagged, scarred across the back of the man's hand. It was unmistakable, a swastika interwoven with an iron cross. The symbols merged into a design that spoke of violence and cruelty. Beneath them, carved into the flesh, were 3 letters in thick, brutal strokes, SFV. The guard's voice, no longer smug, cracked with uncertainty. What is that, SFV? Never heard of it. His bravado had drained away, leaving behind only unease. His mind had already committed every detail to memory. The shape of the tattoo, the curve of every line burned into him. His focus shifted to the van. He keyed another command, isolating the vehicle as it turned from the alley. The camera's angle caught it, a flash of metal against the glare of headlights, the license plate. His voice was cold, surgical. Enhance the plate. The guard fumbled but obeyed, tapping the keys to sharpen the frame until the string of numbers came clear. There, that's the best I can do. Ailes' eyes flicked over the digits, locking them into memory, and his hand moved to the console again, transferring the segment onto a flash drive. The guard, watching with nervous curiosity, asked with a forced chuckle, "You some kind of military or something?" Ailes' reply was short, final. "You ask too many questions." The guard shifted uncomfortably, his bluster gone. "Hey, look man, these guys, they don't seem like the type you want to mess with. You sure you want to do this alone?" Ailes' gaze flicked to him, cold and direct. "You're done talking." The guard swallowed hard and leaned back, raising his hands slightly, offering no further resistance. Ailes turned and walked out, the flash drive and the plate number secured, his mind already moving forward. The guard's voice, hollow now, drifted faintly behind him. "You're a dead man walking." The cool night air met his skin, but he felt none of it. His thumb hit the dial on his phone before he reached the alley's mouth. The line connected immediately, and the familiar voice on the other end snapped to readiness. "Azel, I have a plate," he said, his voice a blade stripped of everything but the hunt. "Sending it now. Man, bald, hand tattoo, swastika and iron cross. 3 letters, SFV. The voice on the other end went rigid. "SFV, never heard of them, but I will. Running the plate and the mark now. Give me a few." Ailes' eyes tracked the faint skid marks where the van had sped off, his body still but his blood moving like fire. "Make it fast." The reply came sharp. "On it." The line dropped. The alley fell back into silence, the world shrinking into the cold hum of the city and the simmering certainty within him. Ailes King was on their trail, and he would follow it until nothing remained of them but dust. The cold night pressed against Ailes' skin as he moved through the shadows, the rail yard's steel bones creaking faintly in the distance. His phone, gripped tight in his hand, lit the path to his next strike. The plate number and the partial details he had gathered from the van were already being processed by the only person he trusted to get him the answers fast. The seconds stretched thin until the phone buzzed, and the voice on the other end came sharp and ready. "I got something. Plates cold, scraped after they dumped the van, but I ran the chassis number through deep scans, traced it to a rental." His mind had already committed every detail to memory. The shape of the tattoo, the curve of every line burned into him. His focus shifted to the van. He keyed another command, isolating the vehicle as it turned from the alley. The camera's angle caught it, a flash of metal against the glare of headlights, the license plate. His voice was cold, surgical. "Enhance the plate." The guard fumbled but obeyed, tapping the keys to sharpen the frame until the string of numbers came clear. "There, that's the best I can do." Ailes' eyes flicked over the digits, locking them into memory, and his hand moved to the console again, transferring the segment onto a flash drive. The guard, watching with nervous curiosity, asked with a forced chuckle, "You some kind of military or something?" Ailes' reply was short, final. "You ask too many questions." The guard shifted uncomfortably, his bluster gone. "Hey, look man, these guys, they don't seem like the type you want to mess with. You sure you want to do this alone?" Ailes' gaze flicked to him, cold and direct. "You're done talking." The guard swallowed hard and leaned back, raising his hands slightly, offering no further resistance. Ale turned and walked out, the flash drive and the plate number secured, his mind already moving forward. The guard's voice, hollow now, drifted faintly behind him. "You're a dead man walking." The cool night air met his skin, but he felt none of it. His thumb hit the dial on his phone before he reached the alley's mouth. The line connected immediately, and the familiar voice on the other end snapped to readiness. "Azel, I have a plate," he said, his voice a blade stripped of everything but the hunt. "Sending it now. Man, bald, hand tattoo, swastika and iron cross. 3 letters, SFV. The voice on the other end went rigid. "SFV, never heard of them, but I will. Running the plate and the mark now. Give me a few." Ailes' eyes tracked the faint skid marks where the van had sped off, his body still but his blood moving like fire. "Make it fast." The reply came sharp. "On it." The line dropped. The alley fell back into silence, the world shrinking into the cold hum of the city and the simmering certainty within him. Ale King was on their trail, and he would follow it until nothing remained of them but dust. The cold night pressed against Ailes' skin as he moved through the shadows, the rail yard steel bones creaking faintly in the distance. His phone gripped tight in his hand lit the path to his next strike. The plate number and the partial details he had gathered from the van were already being processed by the only person he trusted to get him the answers fast. The seconds stretched thin until the phone buzzed, and the voice on the other end came sharp and ready. "I got something. Plates cold, scraped after they dumped the van, but I ran the chassis number through deep scans, traced it to a rental. They just confirmed it without knowing. Cross-reference all traffic cams from the last hour. Look for any vehicles diverting from the main roads toward that plant. I want them pinned." A pause, then the voice responded, tight and ready. "On it. You want backup?" Ailes' answer came without hesitation. "No." "You're walking into their nest, Ale. SFV doesn't play fair. This isn't a war zone, it's a trap." Ailes' voice dropped to something colder, something certain and inevitable. "No, it's a hunt, and they're already dead." The call ended, and the night pressed against Azel with a stillness that felt like the pause before a storm. His fingers curled tightly around the bracelet in his palm, the delicate chain cool against his skin. It was Elysia's, the one he had clasped around her wrist himself, a promise made in gold. Now it was a breadcrumb left behind, not as surrender but as a signal. She was still fighting. She was telling him where to come. 20 million. 48 hours. They had set their price and placed their bet. The money was nothing to him. He could wire it in minutes, see her freed, and walk away. But he would be walking away from more than the money. They would use it to fuel their reach, to buy more weapons, more victims. His 20 million wouldn't save Elysia. It would buy someone else's suffering, and he would have to live with that stain forever. But if he didn't pay, his thumb hovered over his contacts. One call, one transfer, and she would live. The thought twisted through his ribs like glass. His teeth clenched and his body went rigid with the war inside him. They had forced him into a cage of choices, but they had made one mistake. They believed he was a man with only one weapon. He wasn't. The phone slipped back into his pocket. His choice was made. He wasn't paying a ransom, he was collecting one. The bracelet, warm now from his skin, rested tight in his grip as he started toward the warehouse, his steps soundless, his body moving with the fluidity of a man built for the dark. The gang thought they knew him, thought they had him cornered, but they had miscalculated. They saw a desperate husband. They would meet something far worse. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the scent of oil and rust. Overhead, broken windows let the night seep through, casting cold shafts of moonlight across the cracked concrete floor. Red paced lazily, his boots tapping against the ground in a slow, mocking rhythm. His eyes, dark with amusement, flicked toward the chair where Elysia sat, her wrists bound, her body tense but upright. "You know," Red's voice slithered low and cruel, "your husband's probably losing his mind right about now. I bet he's got his phone out, ready to drain every account he's got. That's what love does, right? Makes you weak, makes you pay any price." Elysia's eyes, sharp and unwavering, stayed on him. In front of her, his eyes searching hers, relishing every flicker of defiance. I know enough, rich boy with too much pride and too much money, but it won't save you. You're leverage, sweetheart, nothing more. Alicia's lips pressed into a thin line, but her voice stayed cool, even. You're wrong about him. Red chuckled, a low, ugly sound. I hope he pays fast, because if he doesn't, well, let's just say I get bored easily. And bored men do terrible things. Alicia's gaze didn't waver, but her fingers, unseen behind her, worked meticulously at the frayed edges of her binding. She had felt the loosened fibers from the moment they tied her. She knew every creak in the floor, every sound from outside. She was listening, counting, calculating. She wasn't waiting to be saved. She was waiting to strike. Red stood and turned, his voice carrying his amusement as he called toward the shadows. So, boss, what's your bet? Think he'll pay, or do we get to have some fun? A voice answered from the gloom, colder, harder, and filled with certainty. He'll pay. Men like him always do. Rich, spoiled, soft, they throw money at their problems because they've never had to bleed for anything. Alicia's eyes flickered briefly, her lips curling into something close to a smile. You're wrong, she thought. You have no idea who's coming for you. The air inside the warehouse felt thick, every creak of the rusted beams above carrying through the silence like a warning. The cold from the concrete floor seeped through Alicia's skin, but her eyes remained sharp, her mind cutting through the dark with clarity. Red had left her for the moment, his amusement spent, but she could still feel his presence lingering like a stain in the air. She heard his voice from somewhere beyond the shadows, laughing with the others, his arrogance dripping from every word. She shifted against her bindings, feeling the raw edges of the rope scrape against her wrists, but the pressure was different now. She had worked at the fibers for minutes, her fingers slow, patient, pulling at the weak strands until she felt the first soft give of the knot loosening. But she didn't rush. Not yet. Timing was everything. The metallic clang of boots against the floor drew her attention as Red returned, his smirk pulling wide with the kind of arrogance that came from a man who believed the game was already won. The air between them felt charged, thick with the heat of everything unsaid, the price on her life, the clock ticking down, and the sharp edge of the danger he didn't see coming. You know, he began, his voice a slick drawl, I almost feel bad for you, sitting here waiting on a man to come save you. That's gotta be hell. Alicia's eyes lifted to his, sharp and unreadable, and though her body was still, something in her gaze shifted, cold, calculating, and patient. The smirk on Red's face really think that's how this ends? The barest crack in his armor. I'm the one standing here, aren't I? Alicia's voice was cool and precise, every word aimed like a needle. You're standing here because they let you. You're the dog they let off the leash, the muscle, nothing else. The muscles in Red's jaw ticked, his eyes darkening as he stepped closer. You've got a sharp mouth for someone who's tied up. Alicia's gaze stayed locked on his, her voice dropping just enough to slip under his skin. I'm not the one who should be worried, because when this goes south, and it will, you're the one they'll feed to the fire first. You're disposable, and you know it. His face twisted, the false amusement slipping into something raw. You think you're getting in my head? Cute. Alicia's voice sharpened, threading through his anger like a blade. No, I'm already there. You don't hate my husband, you fear him, because deep down, you know exactly what's coming through that door, and you're not ready for it. The flicker of control snapped, Red's patience thin and cracking under the weight of her words. You're really asking for it now. His hand shot out, fingers closing around her arm. But in that second, she moved. Her wrists, now free from the ropes she had worked loose in the shadows of their conversation, twisted under his grip. Her body snapped forward, her forehead driving into his nose with a sharp, sickening crack. Blood sprayed as Red reeled back with a curse, his hands flying to his face. Alicia didn't hesitate. She launched from the chair, her shoulder driving into his ribs, and the impact sent them both crashing to the floor. Red hit hard, his breath blasting out of his lungs in a hoarse grunt, but his size was a weapon of its own. He rolled fast, his elbow driving toward her ribs, but Alicia shifted, catching the blow with her arm as she twisted free. She was on her feet in an instant, her chest heaving, her body singing with adrenaline, and her voice, sharp and cold, cut through the air. You wanted a game? Let's play. Red, blood smeared across his face and his eyes blazing, growled low as he pushed himself up, his lips pulling back into something feral. "Oh, sweetheart, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Alicia's stance was low, ready, and her reply was a blade. "No, I just gave you a chance to regret yours." And the fight truly began. Red surged forward, his boots slamming against the concrete as he closed the distance between them, his bloodied face twisted with rage. Alicia's eyes tracked his every movement, her body light and ready, her breath sharp and measured. He was bigger, stronger, but he was sloppy, and worse than that, he was angry. He swung first, a wild, heavy hook, but she slipped under it, her shoulder grazing his side as she spun out of reach. The force of his missed punch sent him stumbling half a step, and she struck, her knee driving into his ribs, body jolting from the blow, but his arm lashed out like a whip, catching her shoulder and spinning her sideways. Alicia hit the floor hard, the impact rattling through her bones, but she rolled instantly, instinct driving her into motion as his boot crashed down where her head had been a second before. The crack of his heel against the concrete echoed through the warehouse, but she was already up, circling, her muscles burning, but her mind cold and calculating. Red wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, his grin savage. "Not bad, but you're not walking out of here." Alicia's voice, tight with exertion but sharp with focus, cut back. "You sure about that? You're looking a little slow for someone in charge." Red's snarl twisted into something cruel. "I don't need to be fast. I just need you to stop moving." He lunged again, and this time Alicia didn't evade, she redirected. Her hands caught his arm mid-swing, and she pivoted sharply, using his momentum to send him crashing into a rusted stack of metal crates. The clang of impact rang through the warehouse, and Red collapsed into the debris with a thunderous crash, metal and dust exploding around him. But Alicia didn't wait. Her eyes snapped to the stairwell in the far corner, a faint emergency light casting a dim path upward. She bolted, her footsteps light, the sound of her rapid breaths filling her ears as she reached the stairs and ascended two at a time. Behind her, a snarl of rage and the crash of shifting debris signaled Red's return. "You're not getting away!" His heavy steps pounded against the concrete as he pursued, his bulk slamming into the metal stairs as he climbed with brute force. Alicia reached the upper level, the skeletal remains of a catwalk stretching across the warehouse, its metal grates rusted and worn. She felt the structure groan beneath her weight, but she didn't slow. Her eyes darted ahead, an open hatch, a possible escape, but she needed seconds. Red burst onto the catwalk behind her, his voice dripping with venom. No more running. Alicia turned sharply, her back to the railing, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a cold, lethal edge. "I wasn't running," she said, her voice tight but controlled. "I was leading you." Before he could process the words, her foot shot out, striking a rusted support beam at the catwalk's base. The metal, corroded from time and neglect, gave way with a sickening screech. The platform beneath Red's boots shuddered, then cracked. His eyes flashed with sudden panic as the floor beneath him collapsed. He dropped with a roar, his body crashing through the weakened steel. The impact below was a bone-jarring cacophony of twisting metal and broken crates, and then there was silence save for his ragged, pained breaths from the wreckage. Alicia stood above, her chest rising and falling, the adrenaline surging through her veins as she stared down at the broken sharp from above, sliced through the darkness. "You should have listened when I said you didn't know me." Without another second, she turned and sprinted through the hatch, the night air striking her skin as she emerged onto the rooftop. The city sprawled beneath her, a maze of concrete and shadows, and ahead, freedom. Her pulse thundered, her body screaming from the fight, but her mind burned with a single, absolute focus: find Ale. The night had thickened into a cloak of cold and silence, the wind whispering through the trees as the sounds of her escape faded into the vast, dark wilderness. Her body ached, every bruise a burning memory of the fight with Red, but her mind remained sharp, her focus unbroken. The branches scraped against her skin as she pushed forward through the undergrowth, her breath ragged but steady. She had no sense of time, only the primal drive to keep moving, to get ahead, to survive. Aiel would be coming for her. She knew it as surely as she knew her own heartbeat, but she couldn't wait to be found. She had to lead him. Her eyes, sharp despite exhaustion, scanned the forest floor, and then, with a flicker of clarity, she acted. She reached down, snapping a thin branch and driving it hard into the damp earth, marking her path. Further on, she dragged her fingers through a patch of moss on a fallen tree, leaving a scar in the green. Subtle, quick, but unmistakable to him. She wasn't leaving a trail for them. She was leaving it for Ael and Aiel alone. The forest opened abruptly into a small clearing, and there, half hidden by the grasping arms of the trees, stood a cabin. It was old, sagging into itself with years of neglect, but it was shelter, and in this moment, it was everything. Alicia's body screamed as she stumbled up the creaking steps and pushed the warped door open. The inside smelled of wood rot and dust, the air cold and stale, but it was empty, safe for now. Her eyes scanned the space, an old couch, a fireplace choked with ash, and against the wall, a rusted metal cabinet. She moved to it, her hands fumbling at the latch until it gave with a metallic groan. Inside, a battered first aid kit, the plastic cracked but intact. She pulled it free, her fingers trembling as she popped it open. Gauze, alcohol, bandages, it wasn't much, but it was enough. She hissed as she cleaned the cuts on her arms, her hands quick and practiced. She had learned long ago how to tend her wounds. Her eyes fell on something else tucked behind the kit, an old hunting rifle, its barrel dull with age. She pulled it free, her fingers brushing over the worn wood of the stock. No phone, no way to call for help, but this she could use. The rifle was heavy, unfamiliar, but comforting. She cracked it open, one sharp finality, a signal, a warning, or a line drawn in the dirt. Her pulse pounded as she raised it skyward, her eyes narrowing against the night. The cold metal bit against her cheek as her finger slid over the trigger. She inhaled, slow and steady, then squeezed. The crack shattered the stillness, the echo ripping through the trees and scattering every bird from their perches. The silence that followed felt immense, waiting, holding its breath with her. Then, movement. The snap of a twig, the rustle of branches. Alicia's body stiffened, the rifle lowering, her heart hammering. She turned sharply, her eyes locking on the shadow that emerged from the trees, a man older, rugged, his face weathered by the sun and the wind. A hunter, his own rifle lowered in a posture of caution, not threat. His eyes swept over her, her bruises, her torn clothes, the blood on her hands, and his face hardened with something that felt like concern. "You all right?" His voice, roughened with age and the rasp of the outdoors, broke through the brittle silence. The words carried no urgency, only a slow and careful curiosity. Alicia, though her body was screaming for rest, kept her voice tight and her eyes colder than her pain. Not exactly. The man's eyes flicked to the rifle she held, but his expression did not shift. "Looks like you've been through hell. You're lucky I was nearby." His gaze turned briefly toward the shadowed line of trees. "There's a road just up ahead. My truck's parked there. I can get you out of here." Her body, strained and trembling from the night's violence, wanted nothing more than to collapse, but her instincts, sharpened from the terror she had faced, screamed for caution. She held his gaze for a long moment, measuring the calm surface of his voice, searching for the cracks beneath it. Finally, her voice emerged, low and laced with warning. "You've seen them, haven't you?" The man's face, weathered and unmoved, offered no comfort. "Yeah, I've seen their kind. They've been crawling around these woods like rats. You're lucky they didn't find you first." Alicia felt the tension coil tighter in her chest, every word from his mouth a hook searching for something in her. Her body remained tight, but she kept her voice cold and unreadable. "Maybe they already did." The man's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more a shift of the lines on his face. "Well, you're here and they aren't. Let's keep it that way." The wind cut through the clearing, brushing the leaves into a dry whisper. Alicia's ribs screamed with every breath, her body pleading for safety, yet her instincts, raw and bruised but unshaken, scraped against her skin. She saw nothing certain in his face, only the stillness of a man who waited for her to decide. Her fingers, trembling with exhaustion, loosened slightly on the rifle, though the fire in her voice did not soften. "All right, lead the way."